May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Good grief, what a long gospel reading. Thank you, George. There is so much material here, it boggles a preacher's mind. My guess is that if you visit a number of churches today, you would come up with that many different sermons on this text. Some preachers will undoubtedly choose to zero in on the radical actions of this Rabbi Jesus, because in this one passage, he breaks a whole bunch of rules. When Jesus asked the woman at the well for a drink, she responds, How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? See, Jews didn't share things in common with Samaritans, things like water cups or conversation. After all, Samaritans were considered to be fallen away Jews who had become unclean heathens because of their intermarriage with those people. You know, those folks that are not like us. And then they worship on a mountain, for heaven's sakes, instead of the great temple in Jerusalem. And if that's not bad enough, he was speaking to a woman of all things. Well, that is downright improper. In the first century, there were clear rules about how a Jewish male, especially a rabbi, a teacher, should interact with people, and this was not it. Women were not allowed to worship with the men, whose morning devotions included a prayer. Now, this is real. A prayer that said, "Thank God I am not a woman." Women were definitely not to be seen or heard in public. In fact, there was one group of pious men known as the bruised and bleeding Pharisees, because they closed their eyes when they saw a woman coming down the street, even if it meant that they ran into a wall and broke their own noses. Then, of course, there's this whole idea that she's a woman with something kind of questionable in her life, whether that is about her 5 marriages or her current living arrangements, or the fact that as a widow in a male-dominated culture, she probably had to do some pretty desperate things to survive. Whatever it was, we know she was ostracized from the community. The fact that she is drawing her water from the well in the hot noonday sun meant that she was separated from the other women of the village, because they would have drawn their water in the cool of morning or in the dusk hours, and they would lighten their drudgery with companionship from one another. Not so this poor soul. Yep, some preachers will definitely build a sermon on just how radically inclusive it was for Jesus to be interacting with this outcast Samaritan woman in this story. But then other sermons will be all wound around this image of water from today's text, especially because it shows up in our Old Testament as well. How we all need water to live, and how our thirst drives us to seek that water that we need to survive. And that might lead to a whole exploration into what is meant by living water. Of course, in general, living water is just water that's moving and not stagnant. In fact, when churches are renovated and updated frequently these days, they will create a font that's more of a fountain so the water can move more than just a basin because of this particular passage. And although certainly that can make for some powerful images, I wonder if we're getting too literal here and missing the point. See, the more I have sat with this text, the more I've kind of taken a different take on this passage. See, the woman at the well began her discourse with Jesus around just such literal images of water and thirst. But then she quickly moved to a deeper level, a more meaningful level of conversation. Do you know, this is also the single longest conversation Jesus had with anyone in all of the Gospels? Jesus talks longer with this woman than he does with any of his disciples. Jesus talks longer with this woman than any of his accusers. He talks longer with this woman than any of his family. And she is the first person he reveals himself to in the Gospel according to John. She is the first outsider to guess who he is and then tell others. So according to John's Gospel, she's the first evangelist, and her testimony brings many others to faith. See, for all of these reasons, I think she provides a model for us about moving from a superficial understanding of the words Jesus spoke to something deeper. The more I read this passage, the more it seems to me like that shift happened when Jesus let her know that he knew her, really knew her, as one who was broken and certainly less than perfect, but valued even so. Neither her gender, nor her nationality, nor where she worships, nor her morals, nor her brokenness was to separate her from God. Isn't that wonderful? I think this comes across most clearly in Eugene Peterson's translation of this text in the Message Bible. It reads, "The time is coming," Jesus says, "it has in fact come, when what you're called will not matter, and where you go to worship will not matter. It's who you are and the way you live that count before God. Your worship must engage your spirit in the pursuit of truth. That's the kind of people God is looking out for, those who are simply and honestly themselves before God in their worship. God is sheer being itself, spirit. Those who worship God must do it out of their very being, their spirits, their true selves." This passage, you see, is about our transformation. It's about experiencing God's Spirit and then allowing it to invade our being. It's about getting ourselves out of the way so that we can access that divine spark that is already in us. Last week, we heard the story of the conversation between Jesus and the Pharisee Nicodemus. You might recall that Nicodemus had real difficulty grasping this concept. For him, that movement from taking Jesus' words about being born in the Spirit in a literal way to processing them in a transformative way was really hard. It's as though he couldn't get out of his head to experience God's Spirit moving in him at a gut, heart level. In the case of today's unnamed woman at the well, she got it. She got that Jesus was talking about a different kind of water, water that changes the bearer of it. And we know this because of one little line in the text that almost gets lost. It reads, then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. So easy to miss that tiny sentence in all that is said here, but I think it sums up the whole passage. See, this woman no longer needs her water jar because she has become the vessel. Think about that. If our bodies are 60 to 70% water, what Jesus is really saying is that if you allow God's Spirit, God's breath, God's ruach to stir us up, we become living water. How cool is that? This woman got it. She is the living water, and she is going back to share it with others. On this third Sunday in Lent, may we be like this woman. May we leave this place, this well of ours, renewed, restored, refreshed, but most of all, transformed into living water, to take right back out those doors to a desperately thirsty world. Amen.